Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Beth Whelan. I'm a member of Silent Spring's Board of Directors and also a former epidemiologist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I'll be moderating today's event. For those of you who are new to us, Silent Spring is a scientific research organization and a leading authority on cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday environments, with a particular focus on breast cancer prevention. If this is your first Science Cafe, welcome. Our Science Cafes feature conversations with experts on a variety of topics related to environmental health and are made possible thanks to generous contributions to Silent Spring Institute. Thank you to our donors for supporting these events and our science. A few details about today's program. I'll spend the first 30 to 40 minutes guiding our guests in conversation, and then we'll open things up to the group so you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. Throughout the program, please submit any questions for our guests using the Q&A feature. A quick housekeeping note, we love hearing from you and the chat will be open throughout the program for comments and shared insights. To keep it productive, please be respectful and mindful that this is a shared space. And again, when you have a question for our guests, please drop it in the Q&A rather than the chat so we don't miss it. One final note, this program will be recorded and made available on our website and our YouTube channel. So let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about breast cancer prevention, specifically how new emerging science on environmental risk factors is shaping prevention strategies. We'll get a glimpse of how clinicians are starting to incorporate this kind of information into their practice. We'll also explore how patients can talk to their doctors about environmental exposures and steps that they can take to help reduce their risk. I'm delighted to introduce you to two leaders in this space. Marybeth Hans is the clinical director of the Comprehensive Breast Care Center at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. She has more than 30 years of experience caring for women with breast disease. She received her Master of Science in Physician Assistant Studies from Rutgers University, University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. She holds additional certifications in breast ultrasound and cancer risk assessment and has a particular interest in women at increased risk for the development of breast cancer, with a focus on individualized breast screening and risk reduction strategies. Marybeth also serves with us on the Silent Spring Board of Directors. Dr. Marybeth Terry is the Executive Director at Silent Spring Institute and an internationally renowned cancer epidemiologist. She has more than 26 years of experience leading studies on breast cancer risk factors, specifically on environmental chemicals. She has a focused interest on the drivers of early onset cancers. Dr. Terry is also a professor of epidemiology at Columbia University and Associate Director of Population Science at the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. She has served on numerous prestigious boards and committees at top institutions, including the National Cancer Institute and the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Welcome to both of you. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
So I want to start, Marybeth Hans. Can you tell us a bit about your work as the clinical director of the Breast Care Center at Beth Israel in Boston and what kinds of services you offer?
Sure. And thank you again for the invitation to participate in this important conversation today. My team consists of 5 physician assistants and 1 nurse practitioner, and we see women with a variety of breast concerns, as well as meet with women specifically for formal breast cancer risk assessment. Now, regardless of the reason for the visit, all women are asked to complete a questionnaire that contains personal and family history elements that are related to breast cancer risk. So, in addition to age, history of previous breast biopsies, and family history, there are several hormonal contributors to risk. So, we ask about age at first period, pregnancy history, any hormone use, and menopausal status. Now, the answers to these questions populate breast cancer risk calculators, which provide us with 5-year, 10-year, and lifetime risk estimates for the development of breast cancer. And we use that information to guide us in devising strategies for screening and prevention. Now, although these variables are not included in the risk calculation per se, we do ask about modifiable risk factors such as smoking, alcohol intake, and exercise, because we do recognize that these factors affect risk, and having that information aids us in counseling patients about strategies to reduce that risk. Now, historically, And honestly, for the majority of my career, questions related to potential environmental risk factors were not routinely included in these discussions.
Yeah, that's great. So when did you first start talking to your patients about these issues, such as environmental exposures, and what prompted you to do that?
So, as you mentioned, I've been in breast surgery for about 30 years now, with the last 10 years primarily focused on women at elevated risk for the disease. But it was only about 4 years ago that I realized I was missing a significant piece of the equation. And this was brought to my attention by a patient who asked me, what did I think about the environmental impact on risk? And when I answered honestly that I really had never thought about it, she encouraged me to look at the work that Silent Spring was doing. So I did that, and I was immediately taken aback and a bit embarrassed, honestly, that I had previously been unaware of the body of work that existed around this.
Really interesting. So, Dr. Terry, what do we know about the links between the environment and breast cancer? How would you characterize the state of science today?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question, Beth. And before I answer that, I just want to say how excited I am to be doing this panel with Marybeth Hans. And not just because we share the same first name, but because of her leadership in this issue and bringing it to the clinic. So it's been really great to have her partnership and her expertise and championing this topic. So I really am very grateful to both of you for raising this topic and bringing it to our Science Cafe. So I've been in prevention research for about the same time that Marybeth has been in clinical research. And I have through that work know that really the role of prevention needs to be in partnership with clinicians and because clinicians and healthcare providers have always been the trusted source of prevention information for their patients. And Marybeth Hans mentioned about her patient bringing this to her. Much of what we know in terms of the causes of cancer often comes from patients and advocates pushing for this science and specifically pushing for research. That's how Silent Spring was started because advocates, breast cancer advocates on Cape Cod and throughout the state of Massachusetts pushed for wanting to know what is driving these higher risk of cancer. And so just like Marybeth Hans' original patient pushed for that, we know, for example, that there's windows of susceptibility, including during the intrauterine period when a baby is developing, where environmental exposures can have an impact. And I'm sure Marybeth Hans and you, Beth, know, but I don't know, maybe some members of this Science Cafe community may not know it was a patient's mother who brought up the idea that DES may have caused her daughter's adenocarcinoma of the vagina. And that many of our findings in medical research are coming from patients and conversations with their doctors. So I do think it's really critical that we're having this conversation. And speaking of windows of susceptibility, what we've learned now, and again, thanks to research and thanks for patients and advocates pushing for research, we've learned a lot about how environmental chemicals affect breast cancer. Environmental chemicals can affect many different cancers every single day of our lives, but for breast cancer in particular, there's some windows of heightened susceptibility when the breast is changing in form and function. And these periods include pregnancy for the mother or prenatal exposures for the baby, the same time period we sometimes call prevention studies we do during that window a twofer because it's a time to think about reducing risk for the mother and for the baby, but also during puberty as well as the menopausal transition and pregnancy and lactation in general. This is when the breast and the breast tissue is changing rapidly. And so these are times of heightened vulnerability for exposures to environmental chemicals. Through that research, and a lot of the research led by Silent Spring has really shown us there's a great consistency in the association between chemicals and breast cancer risk. And we're really now at this pivotal point where we can look at hundreds of chemicals at a time and that's how we're exposed to them. Rather than just one or two. And in fact, just a few years ago, some scientists here at Silent Spring really had this groundbreaking result that supported that there's over 900 chemicals in exposures that we come across every single day that are relevant to breast cancer, half of which are in common everyday use plastics. So it's just really important that we have these conversations, that healthcare providers and clinicians like Marybeth Hans are leading the conversation, and that we partner with them to promote ways that these conversations can occur between patients and their doctors.
Great, thank you. So Marybeth, Terry, what do you think are the most important exposures, the ones that doctors and their patients should be paying most attention to?
Right. Another great question. Also, when we think about the environment, there's a lot of different hundreds of chemicals, as I mentioned. But first and foremost, doctors are on the front lines serving their communities. So there are certain communities that have specific exposure. For example, a lot of people are very much aware of PFAS chemicals, and there's certain communities that are more exposed to PFAS chemicals based on their water sources, and other communities maybe have specific environmental exposures based on the use of pesticides and agricultural exposures and things like that. So first and foremost, doctors know the community, they know the community's health. They're often on the front line of identifying the clusters in their community by the patients that they see. So they're critical from that perspective in thinking about community health. Also, doctors obviously already talk to their patients about occupational exposures and specific screening based on occupational exposures. We do know now that active duty military women are more likely to have early onset cancer. We also know through the work of Silent Spring that female firefighters are at a heightened risk of breast cancer. So doctors really have that important role in promoting screening for people at higher risk based on occupational sources. And then finally, it's important for doctors and patients to know that everybody also is exposed to common chemicals through the food that we eat, the water we drink, the air that we breathe. And so there are important conversations that doctors and patients can have regardless of the communities that they're in. And in addition to the communities that they're in, I should say, and counseling women to take, and men and everyone to take simple steps to reduce household exposures. And that's a particular area, and we've talked about that on the last Science Café, based on this science of Silent Spring household interventions, as well as interventions and tools that we have like Detox Me. So I think at the end of the call, we'll leave some of those resources for people online if they would like some of those.
Yeah, we will do that. Great, thanks. So Marybeth Hans, why do you think doctors have been reluctant to talk to their patients about environmental exposures and cancer risk?
Yeah, likely they just haven't had any introduction to the topic. It's certainly not something that's covered in general medical education with any frequency. And I think clinicians tend to stick to what we know and can speak confidently about, and have a general discomfort when getting into areas we lack knowledge in. We are also cognizant of the fact that our words and advice have impact because it's assumed that we should know. And so we really don't want to risk saying something inaccurate.
Yeah, exactly. And Marybeth, Terry, I'm guessing that doctors might also be afraid of causing panic, or do you think that's really the case?
So it's interesting. Again, I'm not a physician myself, but I've heard that at many places, even conferences as recent as a week ago, when I've given talks about environmental chemicals and breast cancer. And I think some of that is, for the reasons Marybeth had suggested, but it's also, I think, coming from a medical model, if you will, where there is a reluctance across the board, not just specific to environmental chemicals, but across the board, to not give out information unless it's clinically relevant. And so that goes back, many, many decades. And, some of it is from a genuine not wanting to cause anxiety without knowing if something is a true cause of a disease. But research, particularly research led by the former executive director, Julie Brody, has really shown that and demonstrated in a very quantitative way that patients actually are less anxious when they receive the same information. And I've talked to many different doctors of different disciplines, including clinical geneticists, where even when there isn't an intervention per se for a disease that is genetic, that patients still want to know if they have that gene or not. And so if you have the information, there is a right to know. And the National Academies of and Science, Engineering, and Medicine have convened panels that have supported that across the board. There is a right to know. If you have the information should be shared. And as I mentioned, Julia Brody has led this research.
Yeah, that's great. So, Mary Beth Hans, you were mentioning, uncertainty. How do you handle that when someone's talking to you about and you're thinking about the science of a particular question? What do you say if a patient asks if it was something at work or an exposure that at home that caused their breast cancer?
Yeah, it's really not uncommon for women to try to identify a tangible reason for the diagnosis, particularly when no genetic mutation has been identified, which is the case 90 to 95% of the time. And fully 85% of women with a diagnosis of breast cancer don't even have a family history. So I just try to point out that the cause of breast cancer is multifactorial, often the coming together of multiple factors, including familial risk, hormonal factors, environmental influences, and likely how our own individual immune system functions. And so it's not really possible, nor particularly helpful to try to identify a single causative factor. And I just try to suggest that the goal moving forward should be focusing on optimizing health, to better tolerate whatever treatments are needed and to reduce the risk of recurrence.
Mhm. Right. And Mary Beth Terry, there are things that people can do to reduce their exposures, right? And put themselves on a path to better health. But some other things are beyond their control, right?
Absolutely. And this is true for many different cancer causes, right? There's things that can be done at an individual level, there's things that can be done at a household level, and there's things that are perhaps most effective through regulation. So, and tobacco is a wonderful example of that.
Mhm.
So there's individual cessation programs for tobacco, but we know that the biggest impact at a population that has happened over the last 50 years for tobacco has been through regulation. So I do think that it's important to know that many chemicals that are in everyday products, including personal care products and cleaning products, many of them are not tested for safety. Certainly, they're not tested for effects on the mammary gland specifically, and people are not aware of that. And again, we can provide resources on that if people would like to know more information. And so people can feel then, okay, if there's all these things that I can't control, then maybe I shouldn't control anything. But again, we like to focus on the fact that even if you think about something like air pollution, maybe outdoor air pollution is beyond, and it's certainly beyond individual control. But indoor air pollution, there are a lot of ways to control that. And so there are some effective ways to reduce indoor air pollution, and we have healthy home tips for that. Which often includes air filters. Here is again why it's an important conversation between patients and their doctors, because in certain states now, air filters can be prescribed for people with chronic conditions so that you don't have to pay for them. They're covered. And so, again, that's an example of things that can be within your control, even if regulation and upstream factors need to be done as well.
Great. So Mary Beth Hans, are you seeing a shift in the medical community where more healthcare providers are talking about environmental exposures with their patients? Or what do you see as the biggest barrier to that right now?
Honestly, I'm obviously more aware myself now and paying attention. And I go to conferences, I attend webinars, all related to breast cancer and breast cancer risk. And I still do not see this as a topic being covered, in those forums. And again, maybe this just goes back to the fact that clinicians are not, being taught this in their training. And so it never really becomes part of the conversation. Maybe as there's more media attention paid to the health hazards, of the chemicals that we're all exposed to, and more people in the lay public sort of press for answers to these questions, it'll be recognized as something that we cannot continue to ignore.
Yeah. So Marybeth, Terry, Silent Spring has been doing a lot of work engaging clinicians. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, of course. So I think even before I took over as executive director, Silent Spring was leading the very first continuing education for doctors and nurses on environmental carcinogens. And I was part of that thanks to the invitation of Julie Brody, and that was done in collaboration with the Dana-Farber. Since that time, we've had two other major CME events, one most recently in New York City in partnership with the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center, and Marybeth Hans was at that and a lecturer, which was fabulous. And I do think what we did, particularly for the last session, is really thinking about the different roles of healthcare providers based on their discipline. So, for example, primary care providers have always been the first line of prevention. They're the providers that inform their patients about vaccination, inform their patients about sun safety, inform their patients about tobacco cessation and alcohol reduction. And so primary care providers have a really important role to play. But just as importantly, a gynecologist, because of these windows of susceptibility, including pregnancy specifically, but thinking about gynecologists who already do clinical breast exams, but also recommend for other breast exams, including mammography and MRI, they really play a unique role too with talking about breast health. What Marybeth Hans and her colleagues do is extraordinary because that is an area where you already have people higher risk of breast cancer and other cancers, and that's a window of opportunity for reducing cancer risk. Because one of the things we've learned very strongly the last 3 decades is that even in individuals at very high risk because of family history, that a lot of that risk can also be modified, that it's not just genetics. In fact, no cancer gene is 100% penetrant, meaning that no cancer gene, you have 100% probability of getting cancer. So, and then finally, we can think about oncologists, and oncologists actually are getting more interested in this topic. I was just the past month at 2 different conferences with many oncologists, and they are getting more interested in this. And Silent Spring will be launching a new program and looking at how environmental chemicals affect treatment, which is a very relevant question given that we know many chemicals, in particular, a group of chemicals we call endocrine disrupting chemicals or EDCs, how they may affect endocrine treatments. And we do know a lot more about how chemicals in general affect your immune system. So it will be important to do this research and to find out whether some of these chemical exposures do affect treatment effectiveness. So that will hopefully be a new area of our research program. But again, all of this needs commitment from research resources and commitment from clinical colleagues. And so again, I'm thrilled to work with Marybeth Hans on some of these new initiatives.
It's exciting. So Marybeth Hans, what can patients do? What's your advice for patients who want to have these conversations with their doctors, but they're afraid of being dismissed? How should they approach the subject?
Women should really feel comfortable sharing what their concerns are and not be afraid to ask the question. I think sometimes, women may tend to dismiss the concerns themselves, perhaps out of fear that the question won't be well received. And even if your clinician is not yet familiar with these concerns, you could be the one to enlighten them, like my patient did for me, and ideally inspire them to learn more. And certainly for those listening to the conversation today, go to the Silent Spring website, print out some of the materials that you'll find there and hand it to them, because it's an excellent place to start. So my hope is that as more and more clinicians become informed and comfort increases, we'll see a shift from kind of reactive conversations to now more proactive ones. And so now when I go through my whole, lifestyle factors section of my interview, I ask them, do you have any known or perceived environmental exposures that you think about or worry about? And I ask them, where did you grow up? Where do you work? Where do you live now? And I think, many people, when I ask this question, they're sort of envisioning like a smokestack in their backyard from a chemical plant or something. So many will indicate that, no, I don't really think I have any exposures I need to worry about. So then I'll specifically ask, did you ever think about any exposures in your own home? For instance, relating to what Marybeth said, personal care products, household products. And I can specifically prompt them to think about products that do contain these endocrine disruptors, like phthalates with fragrance, or BPA in food packaging, parabens in lotions and shampoos, and PFAS. And you start to see the wheels kind of turn. And then fortunately, after I've brought this up, I can suggest some tips on how to minimize these exposures, aided by the incredible catalog of educational materials. And again, the Detox Me app. And Silent Spring made some of these materials available to us in our clinic, which we can provide. So it's incredibly helpful to have these aids to the conversation.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we have time for questions. So this has been great so far. So we have lots of questions that have come in, and some have been submitted in advance. So for those that still want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Um, so let's see, this is probably for Marybeth Hans. Can you talk about alcohol and why doctors are willing to talk to their patients about not drinking or drinking less, but less so about other chemicals?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because alcohol is a type of environmental toxin, just like phthalates or BPA. And yet we are more comfortable discussing alcohol. And probably that's because the solution is easier, just stop drinking or drink less. But when we're broaching the topic of environmental factors, without knowing the resources that are available to aid in counseling of patients, it can be a little dicey to bring it up. It's hard to ask a question when you're likely unprepared for the answer.
Mhm. I guess it also relates to your point about the more things are in the media, the more people feel comfortable bringing them up. And alcohol certainly has been in the media
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah, I might add something to that if I can,
Yeah.
because it's interesting. Alcohol is an interesting analogy, because I do agree with you, Mary Beth, that it's easier to bring up. But even there, it's challenging because it all depends on how they bring it up and what assumptions they want to make in terms of when to bring it up. So often in the clinic, it's still brought up as you're just a social drinker, right? And check the box. I talked to my patient about it. And again, it shows how challenging it can be to have these conversations. That's why I'm particularly motivated, because I feel the way that Marybeth Hans has approached this as a conversation is a useful way to think about moving forward with these dialogues.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. The patients say, I'm just a social drinker. I say, well, how social are you?
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, and can you say a little bit more? We mentioned occupation before. What about the links between pesticides and dry cleaning and breast cancer risk? Either one of you.
I think Dr. Terry probably is best.
Sure. I mean, I can start with pesticides.
Sure.
Over the years, the associations between pesticides, and that includes a whole range of legacy pesticides, primarily were examined in larger studies. I know I worked on the Long Island breast cancer study project. We looked at it back in the 90s. Since that time, the data have gotten stronger and stronger on pesticides, particularly if you look at early onset cancers. That doesn't mean that pesticides are not related to later onset cancers. They are. It's just what we have found in our research is that you get a much more consistent signal, just like you do with genes, when you study cancers earlier in life. And so the associations across the board with legacy pesticides, in fact, we just finished a series of analyses last week that we'll be presenting in a few months, looking at these legacy pesticides in women at higher risk. So in women with, you know, some of them have genetic changes in BRCA1 and 2. Some of them have genetic changes in other genes, but they're at much higher risk of breast cancer. And these legacy pesticides are increasing risk in those populations as well. So the evidence for pesticides and breast cancer has only gotten stronger and stronger and more consistent. With dry cleaning, it's an excellent question. And the challenge has been having very large cohorts of females in certain occupations. And so the data have not been as strong as they have been with pesticides, but it's mostly because of a lack of data and large studies in people with that occupation. That being said, Silent Spring scientists over the past year have done some really interesting and innovative work on exposures in the workplace for people who often are not captured in these large epidemiologic studies. And specifically, they looked at immigrant women in California. And what they found was that there's a whole range of different chemicals that are relevant to breast cancer based on this Silent Spring list in women who work in different occupations like house cleaning, dry cleaning, nursing. And so that is another way at getting at the causality there for those kinds of occupations. And I might just add one last thing about where I think we are with breast cancer is really at a tipping point, is similar to how the population trends change from smoking being primarily something that people of higher economic means did to switching to being more prevalent in people with lower economic means. That transition changed the shape and the prevalence and the incidence for lung cancer. And now, based on some data in California, the people at highest risk are recent immigrants for early onset breast cancer. And that's a tipping point for me because in the past, it used to be people who are just coming to the US are at lower risk because they're coming from countries that have longer periods of breastfeeding, also other exposures that are different than the exposures here. But now we're seeing in recent immigrants that they're at higher risk, which points to, again, these occupational exposures.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a question that's come in, I think, for Marybeth Hans. I was diagnosed with stage 1 estrogen receptor positive HER2 breast cancer at the age of 46. I have no genetic or familial risks. I participated in the UCSF Wisdom study that assessed my risk at 0%. My doctor said most diagnoses are sporadic and they don't know the cause. Are these the kinds of cases that you see most often?
Yeah, a lot of women who have a family history sort of, are the ones that are coming to see us for the risk assessments. But obviously, as I mentioned, most women who are diagnosed do not have a history of breast cancer in their family. And, we certainly don't want to miss these families in terms of looking for genetic predisposition. It's interesting you bring up the Wisdom study because there's a lot of effort now trying to look at what that study looked at was, sort of a risk-based screening approach instead of sort of a one size fits all. I mean, I'm surprised. I'm not familiar that they would give you like a zero. I think you said zero risk of
Mhm.
breast cancer, because nobody really has a zero risk of breast cancer. But, I think we're just looking for whatever markers and approaches that we can find to find women who do not appear to be at increased risk. So, the Wisdom study used something called polygenic risk scores, which is sort of a DNA analysis of these elements known as SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms. We're doing a lot of work at Beth Israel looking at an AI model using a woman's mammogram to determine a 5-year risk because we know the traditional risk calculators that we've been using are imperfect. And so, the more of these tools that become available, the more likely we're able to hopefully identify women who just do not think they have to worry about breast cancer because it's not in their family.
Good, thank you. And Mary Beth Terry, here's a question. As a breast cancer survivor, how can we best share messaging to people about taking steps toward prevention? I feel like people only pay attention to reducing risks after they've been diagnosed. How can we get them to take earlier action?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a key challenge has been that many people are not, except for smoking, many people are not informed about uh, what causes cancer until they meet an oncologist.
Mhm.
So that's why we're so invested in doing continuing medical education for doctors and nurses. Obviously, Marybeth Hans a huge exception to that, but in general, it's people talk about not knowing alcohol causes breast cancer until they're diagnosed with breast cancer. The other part of this question that I wanted to emphasize because the word prevention, we use it, it's hard to change, but we've been trying to use the words risk reduction because sometimes the word prevention may indicate that then once you're diagnosed, the opportunity is lost. But we can always think about reducing our risk because people who've been diagnosed once may have another cancer, may have another chronic condition. Also, reducing risk, whatever stage of life, can help your household reduce risk. So a lot of the exposures we're talking about with environmental chemicals do reduce your risk of other cancers, do reduce your risk of other chronic conditions. And so I do think thinking about a risk reduction strategy, even in people once they've been diagnosed, is important.
Right. Just this was a clarification. I think maybe something Mary Beth Hans said. Did someone's asking, did I hear you correctly that 85% of all breast cancer is without a family history?
Right, right. And breast cancer family history is a big driver of these risk calculations that we provide. And really the biggest problem is that women are being diagnosed all the time and the incidence of breast cancer in women younger than 50 is increasing. And the vast majority will say, I don't understand this. This is not in my family. How
Mhm.
can this be? I think there's a little bit of a false sense of security when there's no family history. Like, this is not something I really need to be thinking about.
Mhm.
But day after day, we're diagnosing women with breast cancer who, did not see this coming. And so that's why, things like the Wisdom study, this new AI risk modeling, anything else that we can look at to try to identify these women who do not sort of present as being at elevated risk because they don't reach these statistical levels of risk based on the traditional models, which are, heavily weighted towards family history. Family history matters. It totally matters. It does
Mhm.
increase somebody's risk for breast cancer. But without a family history, we still have to worry about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Mary Beth Terry, can you comment on the Marin County HHS epi studies around 2004, 2005 regarding the causes of breast cancer?
Sure. I wasn't involved in those studies, but the Marin County studies, I think even started before then. They
Mhm.
started around the time of the Long Island breast cancer study, around the time of the Cape Cod study. And if my memory serves me correctly, they were also driven, like the funding for the research were driven by the community, by advocates who wanted to understand the higher rates of in Marin County. Like I said, I just got back from a conference actually in the San Francisco area, and interestingly, the person who was presenting looked at other hotspots in California, and in addition to Marin County, there were a number of other hotspots. So the Marin County studies, were focused there because that's where the original research started. But a lot of the other hotspots in California and elsewhere, we know more about where they're occurring thanks to kind of the science and where it's at now.
Great, thank you. So Marybeth Hans, there's a question here. Do environmental toxins increase your risk of an extremely dense breast tissue?
I think I've asked Mary Beth Terry this question before. I mean, it's funny, breast density is, more talked about now. There is an independent risk with having a dense breast. Probably the more significant issue is its ability to mask findings on mammography. But I don't know, Dr. Terry, is there evidence that, certain exposures can increase mammographic density?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question I hope we can answer with our early onset program. We have been doing research specifically on breast density in adolescent girls, because one of the challenges with some of the larger studies of breast density that have been published and are done when people get their mammograms, which is usually over 40, sometimes over 50. In other countries, it's over 50. And so, the breast is still changing over 50, but it's changing a lot less rapidly than when you're 12, 13, 14. So, and in a recent study that we have done with young girls in New York City, we did see higher levels of what is the equivalent of a breast density kind of measure. So we looked at that, like the water levels in the breast tissue using an instrument that you can look at that. And it was related to the levels that she was exposed to, the young girl was exposed to while she was in utero. So yes, there is this growing evidence base, but it needs to be bigger, and we do need more research to show that. So yeah, we're trying to do that work now to look at how the chemicals affect the breast tissue during adolescence and early adulthood.
Great. Here's a question probably for Marybeth Terry also. I was recently diagnosed with breast cancer, age 75. I have none of the genetic or other possible causes, but I lived on Nellis Air Force Base by Las Vegas during many 39 of the above ground nuclear testings near there in 1959 and 1960. Have there been any studies showing a correlation?
Yeah, so we, just like Marybeth Hans said, we never know why one individual has their cancer. There is a whole field now, thanks to what we call data science, which is because we have large databases. So there's a whole field now looking at environmental exposures and specifically where you live during these windows of susceptibility. And I want to say it was just like the other night I reviewed a paper where it was distance to nuclear power plants. So I do think because the ability to do these kind of studies is growing, we'll learn more and more at a population level of what has been going on. But I do think, it's been hard in the past because breast cancer is the most common cancer around the world. In women under 50, 2/3 of cancer occurs in women. 2/3 of cancer diagnosed under 50 occurs in women. So often when you get this clustering of cancers, people dismiss it. Not us, but it sometimes gets dismissed because breast cancer is so common. But now, thanks to these tools, I think we can have more rigorous evaluation. And like I said, this paper was looking at distance too. So it's like a dose response effect which then people, look at with greater, certainty because the evidence is just getting stronger and stronger.
Interesting. So just a couple more questions. What public policy initiatives can be advocated for since we know that industry wants to continue unregulated? That's a big question.
So Marybeth Hans, do you want to start there or?
I just think it's important for people to get involved in their own communities, learn what's going on in their communities. Reaching out to legislators is apparently a very effective way to get the message across. I just think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Silent Spring as well is that they do pick their head up from the bench and all the incredible research that they are putting out there to actually advocate for changes, on a broader level because it's really hard for people individually to try to make the best choices. I mean, I personally can't read any of these labels anymore. And everything in my CVS is locked up, so it's like a big chore to try to figure out what's in this thing. So the fact that there's this effort being done to take the responsibility out of the individual consumer is huge.
And I would just echo that and say that, the importance of talking to your legislators, but also talking to your physicians, because I do know that health care providers have extraordinary role to play and have played in driving the national conversation about prevention. And so again, just very grateful for all the leadership Marybeth Hans has done on this issue.
Yeah. We also had didn't one of our scientists testify recently up at the Massachusetts State House on PFAS, right, Marybeth?
Yes, that would be Dr.
Yeah.
Laurel Shader, and
Yeah.
she was just on PBS NewsHour. If anyone would like to watch that interview, we can also put that in the chat. And in December of 2024, she did testify in front of the Senate subcommittee on PFAS
Right.
chemicals. So it's important to be involved in these issues. It's important to know that there are some actions you can take right away within your own family, within your own household. But the community action is absolutely critical. Consumer market shift is absolutely critical, and advocating on the state level is really essential right now when it's challenging at the federal level.
Yeah. So, Marybeth Terry, does our organization have a questionnaire / checklist that people interested in reducing their risks can fill out? And does the organization have a list of good products in the house, in the yard, for example, cleaning products, water filters, etc.?
Yeah, I would refer them to Detox Me, and we will be, for everyone who's registered for this webinar, we will be sending out an email with a list of resources.
Great, great. Okay, let's do one more question. In what way is pregnancy considered a window of susceptibility for breast cancer?
Great. Do you want me to start, Marybeth, or do you want to start?
Yep.
Okay. So pregnancy is a time when the breast cells are changing very rapidly in form and function, and also to get ready for lactation. So that is a window of susceptibility because whenever tissue is changing and cells are dividing, they are more susceptible to both outside forces, so we call those exogenous forces, how they get inside our body, as well as endogenous changes inside your body.
Okay.
Exactly. And we know that breastfeeding is actually considered protective. Cells that have undergone lactation are, terminally differentiated. They've made that final change to perform the function of the organ, and generally a more stable cell is one that's been terminally differentiated.
Great. So thank you. This has been such a great discussion. I want to thank our guests, Marybeth Hans and Marybeth Terry. This has been terrific. We'll be emailing all of you a link to the recording when it's available, so keep an eye out for that, along with some additional resources like the Detox Me app link and so forth. You'll also receive a short survey about today's program, and we do really appreciate the feedback. And as a thank you, one survey respondent will be randomly selected to receive a Silent Spring fleece jacket. Mark your calendars. The next Science Cafe is May 13th, and the title is The Secret Chemistry of Hair Extensions, featuring Silent Spring scientist Dr. Alicia Franklin, who just published a study on the topic that's been getting a lot of media coverage, and Dr. Tamara James Todd at the Harvard School of Public Health. If you'd like to learn more about Silent Spring science, please visit our website, silentspring.org, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Silent Spring also has an app, as we referred to a lot throughout this program, called Detox Me, with a library of practical tips for avoiding toxic chemicals in your everyday life. And finally, you can keep this work going by supporting Silent Spring. Every contribution makes a difference, allowing us to create the science needed to protect people from harmful chemicals and make the world safer. So please join us as you can. We're so grateful for your support. And once again, I want to thank you, Marybeth, Terry, Marybeth Hans, and to all of you for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Beth.